A woman in Halifax opens an envelope she's been waiting 3 weeks for. She has spent her whole life believing she's a Nova Scotian through and through. English on her father's side, Scottish on her mother's, the kind of ancestry that fits neatly on a tartan scarf. The number on the page does not fit neatly on anything. Nearly half of what makes her genetically who she is traces back. Not to Britain at all, but to continental Europe. France, Germany, the Low Countries, places her family never once mentioned at the dinner table. She is not an outlier. She is, according to the largest DNA study ever conducted on this country's population, closer to the rule. For over a century, the story Canada told about itself was simple. 2 founding peoples, the story went, the French who came first and the British who came after, with everyone else arriving later, folded quietly into the edges of a nation already defined. It is the version in the textbooks, the version in the anthem, the version stitched into 2 official languages and a flag with a single red maple leaf. The DNA does not agree. When a genetics team analyzed the genomes of 70,000 Canadians, cross-referencing the data against thousands of known reference populations, the picture that came back looked nothing like the tidy 2-founder story. The average Canadian's ancestry was not dominated by Britain at all. Continental European DNA, the genetic fingerprint of France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, made up 46% of the average genome. British, Irish, and Scottish ancestry, the supposed backbone of English Canada, came in lower at 43%, a 3-point gap. Small on paper, enormous in what it undoes. Because if the numbers are right, the nation most people imagine as an offshoot of the British Empire is, on a cellular level, barely British at all. That is where the story begins. Not with a single dramatic discovery, but with a pattern that kept surfacing every time scientists looked closer. In blood samples, in genealogical archives, in genomes pulled from labs in Montreal and Toronto and Quebec City. A pattern that suggests the people who call themselves Canadian carry a genetic history far stranger, far more scattered, and far more revealing than the story they were handed. Before going further, it helps to sit for a moment inside the version of the country most people already carry in their heads. Ask almost anyone raised in English Canada to describe their ancestry, and the answer tends to arrive fast and tidy. English or Scottish or Irish, maybe with a French Canadian. Grandmother mentioned as a footnote. Ask someone raised in Quebec, and the answer arrives just as fast, just as tidy, pointed the opposite direction. Descended from the original colonists who crossed the Atlantic under the French crown. A lineage treated almost like a birthright. Both stories are comforting. Both are simple enough to fit on a form. And both, according to the genetic record, describe only part of what is actually there. To understand how strange the fuller picture gets, you have to understand what these numbers are actually measuring. Every person's genome is a mosaic, not a single block of ancestry, but thousands of small segments, each one inherited from a different ancestor going back generations. Genetic scientists compare these segments against reference populations, collections of DNA from people whose ancestry in a given region is well documented, and calculate how closely a person's segments match each group. It is not perfect. It cannot tell you your great-great-grandmother's name or the village she left behind. But run across tens of thousands of people, the method becomes something more powerful than any single family tree. A statistical portrait of where an entire population actually came from, as opposed to where it says it came from. Think of it like reading a stack of postcards instead of a single letter. Each postcard is a short segment of DNA addressed, statistically, to a particular region of the world. No single postcard proves where a family came from, but stack thousands of them from thousands of people, and a return address starts to emerge for the population as a whole. That is the tool researchers use to reread Canada. And when they ran that portrait for the country, entire assumptions started to crack. Start with the most obvious one. Canada is a country built in the popular imagination on French and English settlement, the 2 founding nations enshrined in law and language. But continental European ancestry outweighing British ancestry means a huge number of Canadians who think of themselves as English-speaking, British descended, are in fact carrying more German, Belgian, or broader continental European DNA than anything from the British Isles. Some of that traces to 19th and 20th century immigration waves that never made it into the national mythology. German settlers who moved into the prairies in the 1880s and 1900s. Dutch families who arrived after the Second World War. Waves of Central European migration that filled in the country's map long after the founding story had already been written. The textbook says 2 peoples built this country. The genome says the country was never that simple to begin with. Push a little harder on the British side of that ledger, and it fractures even further. English, Scottish, and Irish ancestry are routinely grouped together as if they were interchangeable. A single genetic block labeled British Isles. But researchers who study the region closely point out that Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England each carry their own distinct genetic history shaped by different waves of settlement, invasion, and isolation stretching back thousands of years. Folding all of that into one number for the sake of a simple national narrative erases just as much complexity on the founding side of the story as it does everywhere else. The 43% British figure is not one clean ancestry. It is itself a compressed mosaic, hiding inside a bigger mosaic, so reminder that even the part of the story Canada told most confidently was never as uniform as the telling suggested. Now push into the regions, because that is where the story gets sharper. In Nova Scotia, researchers found the highest concentration of African ancestry anywhere in the country, accounting for 1.5% of the average genetic makeup in the province. It sounds small until you trace where it comes from. During the American Revolution, roughly 3,000 black loyalists, formerly enslaved people who had sided with the British Crown in exchange for a promise of freedom, sailed north and settled along Nova Scotia's coast. Their history was nearly erased from the national narrative for 2 centuries. It survived quietly in the DNA of their descendants, showing up in a genetic dataset over 200 years later as concrete. Measurable proof that the story happened, carried not in an archive but in living cells. Ontario carried the next highest trace at just over 1%. New Brunswick close behind, small percentages, undeniable signatures. There's another layer beneath all of this that no ethnicity percentage from a commercial testing company can fully capture, because it predates every wave of European settlement by thousands of years. The ancestry of indigenous nations who were living across this land long before the words French or British or Canadian existed at all. Population geneticists studying the deeper history of North America have long noted that the ancestors of indigenous peoples arrived via multiple separate migrations spread across thousands of years, developing into hundreds of distinct nations with their own languages, territories, and genetic histories long before contact with Europeans. When later colonial and immigrant populations arrived, and in many documented cases intermarried with indigenous communities, that ancestry did not vanish from the record. It persisted, generation after generation, inside people who today may have no idea it is there, buried under family stories that only reach back 2 or 3 generations before. Going quiet. It is one of the clearest examples of how a genome can hold a truth, that a family tree, built only from documents and memory, quietly lost. Then there's the piece of the country that genetics has studied more intensely than almost any other population on Earth, Quebec. For decades, French Canada has fascinated population geneticists for a reason that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with mathematics. In the 17th century, a relatively small number of French colonists, a few thousand founding families, many of them women, sent specifically by the French crown to establish new households in the colony, settled the St. Lawrence Valley. Over the following centuries, their descendants multiplied into millions, largely marrying within the same regional population for generations. Geneticists call this a founder effect. When a population grows rapidly from a small starting group, the genetic patterns of those original founders become concentrated, magnified, and locked into the population that follows. A team at McGill University set out to map exactly how this happened, using a dataset built from more than 5 million genealogical records spanning 400 years. One of the most detailed reconstructions of a single population's ancestry ever assembled. What they found was not a simple story of French settlers spreading evenly across a new land. It was a map of migration, isolation, and mixing that varied dramatically from region to region, shaped as much by rivers, parish boundaries, and travel routes as by who married whom. Some communities remained genetically distinct from their neighbors for centuries, even while living only a few hours apart. Others blended more freely, pulling in ancestry from further afield. A separate, more recent genetic reference project analyzed the genomes of nearly 30,000 Quebec residents, going further than French-Canadian as a single category. Among the participants were people whose grandparents had been born not only in Canada but in Haiti and in Morocco, reflecting waves of 20th century immigration that reshaped Quebec's population just as thoroughly as the colonial period had, 300 years earlier. The province that built its identity on being the guardian of a single founding French bloodline turned out, when the genomes were actually read, to be a layered record of at least 3 distinct waves of migration centuries apart, each one leaving its mark. Sit with how strange that is for a moment. Quebec's founder effect is famous precisely because it looks like the cleanest possible case of a population descending from one small, well-documented group. A textbook example used in genetics courses around the world. And even that population, the one everyone assumed was the simplest, turns out on closer inspection to be a composite. The 17th century colonists are real. The founder effect among them is real and well documented. But the population walking, Around Quebec today, carrying that founder signature is not a sealed time capsule. It is a moving target, still being reshaped by the same forces, migration, intermarriage, new arrivals, that built it in the first place. So, if you're keeping score, the British country turns out to be less British than continental European. The Loyalist coastline turns out to carry a hidden African founding story 2 centuries deep, and the purely French province turns out to be a genetic patchwork stitched together from colonists, Caribbean immigrants, and North African families whose grandchildren now share the same regional gene pool as descendants of 17th century settlers. None of that fits the story on the coin. And there is one more thread worth pulling, because it is the one that tends to surprise people the most when they see it in their own results. Small but consistent traces of Scandinavian ancestry, showing up across the Atlantic provinces far more often than the settlement record alone would predict. Some of it likely traces to more recent Scandinavian immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries. But researchers studying the broader genetic landscape of the British Isles, the same population that supplied so much of Canada's early settlement, have long noted deep Scandinavian influence woven into English, Scottish, and Irish DNA itself, a legacy of Viking-era settlement and intermarriage more than 1,000 years earlier. In other words, some of that Scandinavian signal in an Atlantic Canadian's genome may not even be a separate migration story at all. It may be a 1,000-year-old layer, folded into the British ancestry that arrived with the settlers who came to Halifax, St. John, and St. John's centuries later. Ancestry inside ancestry, one migration nested quietly inside another. There's a temptation, at this point, to treat these findings as simply quirky trivia, a fun fact for a dinner party, the kind of thing a home DNA kit turns into a colorful pie chart. But the deeper implication is harder to shake off once you sit with it. National identity, in Canada, as in most countries, was built on a founding myth, a clean story of who arrived first, who built what, who belongs. The genome does not narrate. It does not care about founding myths. It simply records what actually happened to real bodies, real migrations, real people who crossed oceans for reasons that rarely made it into the history books. War, famine, opportunity, coercion, love. And when you read that record honestly, the population it describes looks far messier, far more improvised, and far more interesting than the flag suggests. It is worth pausing here to be precise about what is solid ground and what is not. The academic research, the McGill genealogical reconstruction, the multi-ancestry genome reference built from thousands of Quebec participants rests on peer-reviewed methodology, large verified datasets, and reproducible statistical modeling. That is about as strong as population genetics gets. The wider ethnicity estimates, the kind produced by commercial DNA testing companies analyzing tens of thousands of customers, are a different category. They are useful in the broad pattern they reveal, continental European ancestry outweighing British ancestry, meaningful African and indigenous and Asian ancestry, threading through supposedly homogeneous regions, lines up with documented immigration history. But the exact percentages shift depending on which reference panel a company uses, how it draws its regional boundaries, and how it updates its algorithms year to year. Treat the direction of the finding as solid. Treat any single decimal point as a snapshot, not a law of nature. What nobody disputes, in either the academic studies or the commercial datasets, is the underlying shape of the story. This country's genetic makeup was never a simple two-column ledger of French settlers on one side and British settlers on the other. It was built in layers. Indigenous nations who were here for thousands of years before any ship arrived. French colonists who intermarried and multiplied along the St. Lawrence. Black loyalists who sailed north seeking freedom the crown had promised them. German and Dutch and Scandinavian families who filled in the prairies a century later. And, in the decades since, immigration from virtually every part of the planet, each wave leaving a measurable trace in the genome of the generation that followed. Here is the moment the story turns. Because if a population's DNA is a layered record rather than a single bloodline, then the entire premise of a founding people, the idea that some Canadians are more original, more authentically Canadian than others, collapses under its own weight. Genetically, there is no single real Canadian to return to. There never was. The Halifax woman with more continental European ancestry than British, the Quebec family whose grandparents came from Casablanca, the Nova Scotian whose genome quietly preserves a loyalist voyage from 250 years ago. Each of them is not an exception to the Canadian story. Each of them is the Canadian story told at the level of the cell. That reframes the original question the researchers set out to answer. It was never really, where did Canadians come from, as if there were one clean answer waiting to be found. It was, how many different origins can converge in a single population before the idea of a single origin stops making sense? The data suggests the answer for this country is more than anyone assumed and further back than anyone expected. There's a practical reason this matters beyond identity and pride. The same genealogical datasets that reveal these patterns are now being used for something far more consequential than tracing where a surname came from. Researchers building these population maps have pointed out that understanding how a population's genetic structure formed, where founder effects concentrated certain gene variants, where isolated communities remained distinct for generations, has real implications for medicine. Certain hereditary conditions cluster more heavily in populations shaped by strong founder effects, like parts of Quebec descended from a small colonial founding group. Knowing the true shape of a population's ancestry, rather than the simplified version taught in schools, helps researchers predict genetic health risks more accurately and design studies that actually reflect the people they are meant to serve. The myth of a simple, uniform Canadian genome is not just historically inaccurate. Treated as fact, it could make medical research less precise for everyone it claims to represent. Which brings the story back to where it started. An envelope, a number, a woman, standing in her kitchen in Halifax, rereading a percentage she did not expect. She is not confused because the science is wrong. She is confused because the story she grew up with left out most of the people who made her. She is not alone in that gap. Millions of Canadians have opened similar results over the past decade, and the reaction tends to follow the same pattern. First surprise, then a kind of quiet reshuffling of the family story, then often curiosity about the parts of the past nobody thought to write down. A German great-great-grandfather who arrived on the prairies chasing cheap land, a loyalist ancestor whose name shows up in a 200-year-old settlement register. A Quebec grandmother whose own grandmother crossed an ocean from a place the family stopped mentioning generations ago. But none of it changes who these people are today. It changes how far back today actually reaches. That gap, multiplied across tens of millions of Canadians, is the real discovery here. Not a single shocking ancestor, not a hidden royal bloodline, not a secret buried in one family's past. A quieter, larger shock, an entire nation's self-image sitting several steps behind its own genome. The textbooks will need new additions. The flag will stay the same. But the next time someone calls themselves a true Canadian, ask them which of their ancestors they mean, because according to the DNA, there were a great many more of them, from a great many more places than the old story ever had room for. If you traced your own ancestry back far enough, which wave do you think you would land in? The founders, the loyalists, or the ones who came after, quietly rewriting the country's genetic map without anyone noticing? Drop your guess in the comments before you scroll on.